So when you've looked at those assessments, we can see whether there's the differences left or right, whether you're miles off the range of motion you need, or way out of the range of 120 degrees in regards to active stability, or not able to move your thoracic spine so well. We can then look at these prerequisites, work out what needs to be addressed as a result of looking at them, and then use the following interventions to try and address them. So rather than these next few slides where we're going to look at how we address them as solely the only exercises that you do on your shoulder, try and think of these exercises or interventions as things that you want to integrate into your programming that you have already, into your sport prior to going into it. So say if you're a rock climber and you've identified that there's restrictions in your shoulder movement, restrictions in your thoracic mobility, that you integrate some of these exercises or interventions prior to then going into the gym wall or out on a climb outside as a means of opening yourself up to these ranges, so you're able to control them through your sport there. So going back to those 4 functional subcomponents, knowing that they all influence each other, let's have a look at how we can kind of open up that thoracic mobility. So you've had a look at your thoracic mobility, for instance, realize that there's a few things we need to do on it. We're going to presume that you've gone through that whole wallop of assessments, and we're not absolutely primo on everything. And even if we are, we want to try and bring in some of these interventions prior to then going into your sports, or prior then to going into your gym sessions. So thoracic mobility, we've got those 2 movements, the flexion extension and that rotation. That cat-cow position that we did before was really good for assessing whether we have a bias in one area or the other. But then when we're training thoracic mobility, if we've got a bias in the area, we're likely going to keep doing the movement of that area. So by doing a thoracic extension through flexion extension of the spine with your butt down on your heels here, we can kind of restrict the amount of mobility that's coming from your lower back there. So it's a good way of kind of honing in on just your thoracic spine rather than leveraging off all the ranges of motion that you've got coming out of your lower back there. If we look at rotation, there's a couple of exercises. We're looking at things that help us restrict the movement through any other area of the spine or hips. So this one here is just a book opener. This one's a thoracic thread the needle, or thread the needle, not thoracic, thread the needle, that you could use to try and then open up that range. So you're kind of using these as almost like keys to open the door to then leverage the full performance of your shoulder. That improvement in thoracic mobility after one of the few exercises there, then we'll have an influence on our scapular thoracic control. So now we're looking at the scapular thoracic control, which we haven't really looked at in the testing. And we're going to have a means of improving both your upward rotation as well as your general scapular humeral, or scapular thoracic, rhythm between these couple of exercise examples. So this wall slide here, I'll just show you again, allows us to kind of get into a position where we're biasing the scapula into working towards upward rotation. So you're creating a bit of external rotation, you're pressing through your serratus anterior, and it's a real good exercise that we can use to try and open up the upward rotation of the shoulder. And you might slide that in prior to the session if you've got that limitation of raising the arm above head height through that shoulder flexion or through that palm facing up shoulder raise. Where these IYTs or YTIs come in as a great intervention is, again, with that thoracic, with that shoulder flexion and palm up shoulder raise. But usually when you're getting to a point where you've actually got some good control in that range, but you just find that when you do those movements, we're getting a little bit more activation in that shrugging motion rather than allowing for us to move the shoulder through that healthy range. Okay, so we've opened those two gateways. We might go back and test our movements again. Apologies, I've had COVID 2 weeks ago and I'm still coughing, so bear with me with the hydration here. The third thing we're looking at is now reducing that internal bias. So when we say internal bias, we're looking at the fact that we've got a lot more muscles and larger muscles that help to internally rotate the shoulder. So we want to have a go at trying to address the tension that can come about from just the activation of these muscles. The big one that people go to straight away is your pecs. We see the shoulders rolling forward, presume the pecs are quite tight, do a bit of release through the pecs there and kind of leave anything posterior in the shoulder. But it kind of makes sense to maybe look at the lats initially. So the lats are an internal rotator of the shoulder. They also kind of attach to your thoracic, they attach to your thoracic spine at the lower half and into your lumbar spine. So it kind of makes sense. They don't have just an influence on the shoulder. They also have an influence on your thoracic spine. So it makes sense to kind of release them as well. This guy here, this posterior shoulder release or myofascial release of the shoulder is a good means of trying to get out of that added tension coming from the lats. And with myofascial release, what we're doing there, without kind of going into the deep detail of myofascial release, is we're creating a stimulus in the body that creates a subsequent kind of down regulation of the tension in the tissue that then allows us to kind of open up into a bit more range of motion by reducing the tension of that tissue that might be restricting that range of motion. So doing that myofascial release on the lats, maybe the pecs, maybe into the delts, depending on what area gives you the most feedback in regards to kind of a trigger, will help open up that or help reduce that tension. Now, with that myofascial release comes the kind of, prescription that you don't want to just be doing it to give yourself a light little massage. So if you're like jumping on a foam roller and just up and down, having a good old chat without any kind of real kickback and stimulus, then we're not really working at a high enough amount of stimulus on that trigger to really relax the tissue there. The other thought is to then reduce that internal bias by opening up through stretching. Again, a bit of an area that people talk about conflictingly around what should be good for in regards to stretching. If you're tense in any area, holding a stretch for a long period of time is going to really allow you to open up that tissue through that relaxing of the tissue into deeper ranges there. Here we've got this is Chris, one of the other trainers. He's a better looking lad than I am, doing a bit of a passive stretch there that's similar to a child's pose, but a little bit more bias on that external rotation. So this is a great example of him getting his shoulders into a larger amount of shoulder flexion, has the hands turned out, elbows in, and that's really opening up all those internal rotators that restrict that shoulder flexion movement. So it's another bit of ammo to potentially add to your the prerequisites to your full components of function in the shoulder. Okay, the last one, the posterior shoulder. So kind of looking at that scapular thoracic scapular-humeral relationship. So generally the rotator cuff muscles. So your rotator cuff muscles are coming from your scapula into your humerus there. And we kind of get to a fork in the road at this point. We've done the mobility through our thoracic spine. We've done the mobility through our those major internal rotators. We've looked at improving the scapular thoracic rhythm, and now we're looking at the last area to really make sure our shoulder's ready to go in the way of activity, or that we're addressing the issues at bay by looking at this last spot. So strength versus stability. When we looked at that rotator cuff group, we know that all the actions of the rotator cuff muscles are based on their rotation or that abduction, but we know that their kind of unified function is to stabilize. So when we get to this point, we kind of have to make a bit of a decision in the road. Are we more aligned to that side that is kind of entering the gym space? Are we more aligned to that side that's coming back from injury, rehabbing a joint? Or are we older and coming into the gym for the first time, or even just in someone that's over the age of 65 that's going back into that loading of the shoulder? So if we're looking at strengthening that shoulder or stabilizes the shoulder, we're looking at a exercise that allows us to load those muscles. Chris here is doing this as an external rotation with the cable machine. Now, this external rotation of the cable machine at 45 degrees is kind of isolating that external rotators of the shoulder. And again, we're taking away from that internal bias and posturally helping that shoulder into the right position. However, if we looked at trying to improve the function, we're actually looking at an exercise that has us challenge the stability of the shoulder. So this guy here is doing a kettlebell arm bar. The kettlebells work really, really good for stability work in your shoulder when you're testing function, because he has to work pretty hard for that kettlebell not to fall left, right, or backwards, and really reach up with that shoulder to ensure that it doesn't just drop down in the shoulder blade. He's testing the stratus anterior. He's testing a lot of things there. So there's quite a few things you could do with the kettlebell. You can even press it up like that with that underhand grip to really test the shoulder stability as well. But it's not limited to that. There's plenty of other things there as well. So we could also incorporate potentially working a bit of shoulder stability in a plank position where we're lifting one hand at a time, tapping the shoulders, or working with, say, a TRX and doing that fall out position where now it's really, really advanced, working on that shoulder stability overhead rather than just in that horizontal position there as well. So if we're summarizing all those things that we've just gone through, like that's a lot of information. How does this all kind of come together, Jake? So basically, you've gone through this to have a look at your shoulder after today's session and thought, alrighty, we're going to go through the tests that Jake does to just check on how the shoulder health is. We're going to look at our thoracic spine. We're going to look at our shoulder flexion. We're going to look at our external rotation, internal rotation, and we're going to look at our active functional range. We've taken down those measures, found out that left was worse on this, right was better on that, left was worse on this, right was better on that. From there, we've stepped across and said, all right, well, my thoracic spine was definitely terrible through my range of motion. So I'm going to double down on those two thoracic mobility exercises. I'm then going to continue on through doing some scapular thoracic movements like the upward rotation or some YTIs there to help improve my scapular thoracic control. From there, I'm going to release into my shoulder. I'm then going to look at actually testing my shoulder stability through a bit of a shoulder tap exercise, trying to test my ability to hold that shoulder position with the scapula. And then I'm going to do a test there again and see where I'm at from my previous test results. That's one way to look at it and see whether those things help address some of those issues. And if they make a big change, fantastic. The other way to look at it is to take those measures and know where you're sitting at from a shoulder function position, then integrate these, I guess, gatekeepers within your training programs or within your sports. So say, I mean, biking's a bit different because you're just holding that one position, but say it's rock climbing, for instance, and we're looking at getting onto the wall rather than starting off with solely just moving across the wall, building up a little bit of warm-up through your upper body, lower body, is to actually integrate 4 of these prerequisites that lead into each other into your warm-up session. So going through each of these exercises, then doing a bit of warm-up through an easy route there, going back down, doing another round of it, going through those routes again there, and then building on to your actual session. So you're kind of then managing the position you're at by mitigating any further kind of degradation that might happen because you don't have access to these different ranges there as well. Okay. Alrighty, so that's a lot of information, and I know I spat a lot of information out there. So no doubt, if you haven't, I'm sure a lot of people have heard of the Australian accent in the Valley here, but I definitely mumble a lot. So if you need to look through that again, by all means, it's definitely one to work through a couple of times. The thing I wanted to finish off on here is that's, I think, a great takeaway for how we can kind of maintain and optimize the shoulder overall from a functional point of view. But then how can we kind of step up from a performance side of things? And that's where we have to start bringing in some additional strength training or additional stability training that might be very specific to yourself or specific to the sport that you're working in. So what I thought I'd finish off with is providing you guys with some key takeaways when it comes to strength training, rather than just feed you with a handful of exercises that I think are good for just general performance of the upper body here. So when we look at strength training, all it comes down to is biomechanics versus physics versus anatomy there. So if you see the pictures on the right, it's just a whole heap of meat on the back and a whole heap of meat on the front that help kind of create the actions of the shoulder to produce the movements that we need against the demands that we put against it. So we want to kind of think when we're looking at putting together a strength program, what areas do we want to target that are specific to our improvement of function, or what areas do we want to target that are specific to our sport, and how do we load them? So we're going to look at just solely more or less strength through a pulling and through a pushing domain, and kind of break down some key things that you should think about when deciding on like what exercises to do and how to load them there as well. So first of all, for a pulling aspect, you want to be looking at hand position, as it matters a lot. So when you go into the gym and you're looking at trying to improve your pulling strength, the often go-to for people that I see classically is just keeping those hands neutral and then just pulling and building up the load to a higher amount as you start to feel like you're improving in regards to your performance. However, if we change the hand position, we alter the demands in the back there. So as we change the hand position from a neutral position, which would kind of load more of a pattern into these rhomboids, to maybe more of a pronated position where we kind of load more into that middle trap. So pronated would be hands down, to more maybe a supinated position where we could load more into the lats there as well. You can kind of see the fibers have all their different angles. So as we change the hand position, we're actually changing what's happening at that shoulder joint each time we move. So if we're solely just moving through that neutral plane, we're kind of aligning a lot of our load through that range rather than anything horizontally and anything down through those lats and some of the larger muscles like your delts there as well. So making sure you've got a variety of hand positions when you're working vertically or horizontally on your pulling exercises and altering them throughout your training blocks. The other thing to remember as well with the pull is the intent of your pull. So it's kind of like this mind-muscle connection theory that comes in a bit as well. You see a bodybuilder's got the ability to really contract singular muscles. They can make their pecs move because they've worked that muscle group so much. They've got a real good kind of neural connection to that muscle group. When we work, say, a pull, we want to really work into the lats. We want to focus on driving our action into that muscle group rather than just focusing on solely bringing that arm up and down. It's actually have the intention of pulling it in. If we're doing a protracted or protracted pronated grip, that we're focusing on the mid traps, we want to focus on really pulling those shoulder blades together, but not driving the elbows back. So that's the kind of intention when it comes to pulling that we need to focus on. And the last one to consider is basically your arm position and how it finishes. So you see this lady here who's just basically driving her hands towards her chest as close as she can. So it means her elbows have gone right up. When we've done that, we've really driven our shoulder position quite far forward and shrugged up into the neck rather than worked through that region that she kind of wanted to work through. So when you are doing the pull, make sure you're focused on just bringing those arms by your side rather than trying to drive them back as far as you can. bring them down and by your side rather than try and drive them back as far. And even if they're off your side, making sure they're kind of coming to your side rather than driving again past that torso position and then bringing in that shrug position. Okay, so these are just a few examples of like the different hand positions. See this more in the mid traps. This one here getting down into your lats there as well. And then this one here is that kind of rhomboids, but we can see with driving the elbow down into the back there, back into the hip, which is kind of getting us a bit more activation through our lats. The other thing you can note with those ranges of motion, like I'm probably coming up a bit too high with this one, but when you're reaching down and really stretching to the floor, so we're allowing that shoulder blade to really travel rather than just pinning it back against your body and only using the portion of the shoulder that moves the glenohumeral joint, the muscles that move the glenohumeral joint, rather than allowing that real big movement in the scapula there. Okay, the last one there is the strength and pressing. So a few considerations that you want to think about when you're looking at training through strength or improving your strength through a pressing range is your output versus performance. So are we looking at trying to just bench press as much as we can? And that's our intention because we brought our ego to the gym and we wanted to intimidate everyone at the bench press, or are we actually looking to get more performance out of the shoulder? So rather than pinning those shoulders back and pushing as much as we can, do we want to actually see that shoulder blade move with the arm in the press with whatever exercise you're doing there? That could be overhead as well as horizontal there. Here, same thing as the rows. Horizontal versus overhead, are we getting a good variety of different angles in the pressing? That's going to change how we load the tissues in our shoulder. And then wide versus narrow, are we just looking at our program? Do we notice that everything we do is very wide in nature, or is everything very narrow in nature? Have we kind of missed some of the areas that we need to look at loading there for more strength and function and overall performance with our pressing motion? And the kind of like final bit around the pressing that I wouldn't think that's worth talking about based on whether you've got good function of motion. I probably don't have the license to really load above my head. Well, I know I don't have the license to load above my head because I can't control my arm above that 100 up to that 120 degrees of motion with that external rotation. So I'm going to have to look at graduating my load overhead in that range of motion. So just a bit of an example of how you could do that would be that landmine press. You can see this guy isn't pressing very high overhead. It's just straightforward rather than, well, not straightforward, it's forward on an angle. So it's not quite overhead. He's getting good movement through his shoulder blade as he presses up. It's all fake mirrors. It's just good lighting, I'm sure. And then these two examples, if you can get this one to load here as well, where he's dropped down to a knee. So now he's pressing a little bit more overhead. And then and the last thing from a strength programming point of view to consider, so when you're looking at the stuff that you've got already in your strength programs, or when you're looking to build your strength programs, is first of all, leave your ego at the door. So make sure that you're not going in there trying to push as much weight as you can just for the sake of pushing load. That's not going to put you in a good position, and it's only going to lead to a time in which you hit a peak and you potentially get injured there. But in regards to intensity or volume, like how much you need to do to ensure that you're kind of creating the adaptations you need to make sure your shoulder's getting stronger, or the areas that have support around the shoulder are getting, the muscles around the shoulder are getting stronger. We want to be working in general, as a general rule, to what we call 2 RIR. So this is 2 reps in reserve. So no matter what you choose for your rep range, be it 5 reps, be it 10 reps, that you've chosen a load that allows you to work to a position or work to that rep range. And when you get to that rep range, you're still in control of the movement, but you feel like you could probably only get another couple of reps in before that technique broke down due to fatigue, or that you'd only be able to really get 2 reps more in. And the reason we need that is tissues only change due to stimulus. And if you don't have enough stimulus there, we're not going to create an environment that demands change in that tissue. That changes a little bit as a recommendation if we're working totally just on skill, or like, for instance, that rotator cuff movement that you're just, or the scapular thoracic movement. We're just trying to look at getting you better at actual motor control. Different story, but if we're looking at strength, looking at 2 reps in reserve, 5 sets a week on a muscle group will maintain the strength. But if you want more muscle size, then sometimes longer rest breaks. If you're really working at high levels of intensity, then even longer rest breaks is probably required there as well.